Okay. So I think we'll go ahead. I want to introduce our panelists here. Sitting right next to me here is Dr. Russell Targ. Russell is a physicist and author who's a pioneer in the development of the laser and laser applications. He was also co-founder, as you heard, of the Stanford Research Institute's investigation into psychic abilities in the 1970s and 80s, as he says, the real X-Files. His work in this new area called remote viewing was published in Nature, the Proceedings of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers at IEEE, the Proceedings of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and elsewhere. He's co-author of 7 books dealing with the scientific investigation of psychic abilities, including most recently The End of Suffering, book published in 2006, and Limitless Mind, A Guide to Remote Viewing and Transformation of Consciousness from 2004. He's also the author of more than 100 scientific papers, which is several more than me. In 1997, Targ retired from Lockheed Martin Missiles and Space Company as a senior staff scientist, where he developed airborne laser systems for the detection of wind shear. He now teaches remote viewing internationally, pursues ESP research here in Palo Alto, and is also publishing special editions of classic books in psychical research. Next to Russell is Dr. Jack Sarfatti. Jack is a theoretical physicist specializing in the relationship between quantum physics, cosmology, especially dark energy, and advanced propulsion. Working largely outside academia, he argues that mind may be crucial to the structure of matter, that retrocausality, effects backwards in time, may be possible, and that physics, which he calls, quote, the conceptual art of the late 20th century, my favorite phrase, that this has replaced philosophy as a unifying force between science and art. He was co-author, as I mentioned, along with Fred Alan Wolf and Bob Tobin, of the book Space, Time, and Beyond, originally published in 1975. He has 3 other books of his own, Space, Time, and Beyond 2 from 2002, Destiny Matrix from 2002, and Super Cosmos from 2005. Dr. Sarfatti was the founder of the nonprofit think tank, the Physics Consciousness Research Group in the 1970s. He's currently executive director of the Internet Science Education Project right here in San Francisco. And then finally, we have Dr. Fred Alan Wolf, who's also known as Dr. Quantum. Fred is a physicist, a writer, and a lecturer. He earned his PhD in theoretical physics in 1963. He began researching the field of high atmospheric particle behavior following a nuclear explosion. Let's say studying the effects, not causing explosions. Wolf's inquiring mind has delved into the relationship between human consciousness, psychology, physiology, the mystical, and the spiritual. He continues to write, to lecture throughout the world, conduct research on the relationship of quantum physics to consciousness, just as in the period I was writing about. He's the author of 14 books and audio CDs, including books like Taking the Quantum Leap from '82, which won the National Book Award, Parallel Universes, The Dreaming Universe, The Eagle's Quest, The Spiritual Universe, Mind into Matter, Matter into Feeling, The Yoga of Time Travel, How the Mind Can Defeat Time, Dr. Quantum Presents, a little book of big ideas, and in his most recent book, just out this past spring, called Time Loops and Space Twists, How God Created the Universe. Dr. Wolf lectures, researches, and teaches worldwide. He's also appeared as the resident physicist on the Discovery Channel show The Know Zone, that's K-N-O-W, and on many radio talk shows and television shows across the US and abroad. So I wanted to get the panelists talking amongst themselves to start reminiscing about these times, and of course we'll have time for your questions as well. So let me toss out a question to each of you, just as, to fill out a bit more of the picture. How did you get interested in science in the first place, and then where did that lead you? How did you get on that train that led to things like the events we've been hearing about so far? Russell, why don't we start with you?
I failed as a scientist here because I couldn't take the microphone apart. Is this even on? Yeah, it's on. Well, I got into science because as a young person, I had 2 parents who were utterly uninterested in science. My father was a publisher, my mother was a press agent, and I had very poor vision. So if I wanted to learn how to take something apart, I was going to have to do it myself. So I had a long childhood career of dismantling things and putting them back together and building hi-fi amplifiers as a high school student. And that led me into, obviously, experimental physics rather than theoretical physics. What probably led me to this distinguished symposium is my background in magic. That I grew up in New York City, where I had a chance to visit the professional magic emporiums on 42nd Street, talk with magicians, see magicians doing magic at the penny arcades, buy tricks, and go home and mystify my parents. Of course, every child loves to fool adults. I was no exception. What I discovered standing on the stage doing magic tricks at bar mitzvahs and art openings is that from time to time I would have a psychic visualization of the answer to the trick I was doing by sleight of hand. So I might have passed out bits of paper to the audience, and the audience, individuals would ask a question, and I, by trickery, would know what the question was, but often I had the experience of standing on the stage and knowing far more than was contained in my little slip of paper. So as a young teenager, I had the idea the psychic stuff was really going on and was available, and I began to get familiar with the professional parapsychology literature. Briefly, as a graduate student, I studied psychology and was well aware that nobody was going to make a living doing ESP research, however interesting it might be. So my graduate research was in physics, and I was invited by the inventor of the laser, Gordon Gould, to join his fledgling operation on the development of the laser. So that's how I became a laser pioneer. I didn't invent the laser, but the inventor invited me to come and work with him. After I had 15 years tenure experience working on lasers, I decided I was then very well known as a laser pioneer. I then was willing to take the risk to start up a ESP research operation at Stanford Research Institute, and I did that with my colleague Harold Puthoff, who was also a laser pioneer. We met at Stanford because I found him giving a talk very similar to one that I would give. So, because I know that my partners are both very talkative as I am, I want to tell you the two things that are takeaway messages from my experience. First is psychic abilities are real, they're easy to learn, and the research is easy to replicate. It has to do with non-locality because psychic ability is independent of the distance. The most important thing, we were supported by the CIA for 25 years at SRI, so probably the most paranormal thing about our research is that we had continuous government support for 25 years. And if any of you have tried to get government support for a second year, you know that's hard to do. So the fact that we got continuous support for more than 2 decades is paranormal in itself. What we are confident of is that psychic ability is independent of distance. That is, there are 2 things that I know. One is that it's no harder to describe what's going on in Soviet Siberia than it is in the back room across the corridor here. Increasing the distance does not in any way degrade a person's psychic ability to describe and experience what's happening in a distant place. The other more surprising thing that I'm also confident of, and all people who have read the literature or performed experiments are confident of, is it's no harder to describe what's happening in the next day or in the next week than it is contemporaneously. That is to say, we had no more trouble forecasting changes in the price of silver futures a week in advance than we did describing where an airplane was hidden the next day. That is to say, for 9 weeks in a row, we forecast silver futures, were correct every time, and made $100,000 of real money. Just as we could quiet our mind and describe where a downed airplane was somewhere in northern Africa, send a team there, and find it in the desert before the Russians. So what we call non-locality pertaining to psychic abilities is not necessarily the Bellevue of locality, but rather the fact that psychic ability is independent of spatial and temporal distance. And the thing that the 3 of us would all agree on is what Henry Stapp said 2 decades ago. Stapp is a distinguished member of the physics department at the University of California. He said, perhaps the most important discovery in all of science is the discovery of non-locality. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jack.
Okay, let me just continue what Russ started here, because I want to get back to something that's happened very recently because of David's publication of his book, which got me thinking again of the patent disclosure that he briefly showed you, in which he has also his figure 9.1 of his book. And, for at least 10 years, I basically accepted the conventional wisdom that I was wrong about that. There's no way it can work for the reasons that David has mentioned, and other reasons that the no-go theorems are really true. But recently, I think I've discovered a loophole so that what I had in the patent application may actually work, but it involves using what are called coherent states, which lasers, among other things, generate. And there may be a loophole, but what's going on is that it's a new theory. It's an extended theory. It's not just the ordinary quantum theory. Like what David was saying about the money transfer in Vienna, that will still work. That's still untappable because you use a certain kind of light source, these individual photons. But if you use a different light source, if you use a different kind of light source, you may be able to signal. It seems like you'll be able to signal. And the equations are very precise. It involves what's called spontaneous symmetry breaking. You may have all heard of the Higgs particle. It's similar to that kind of physics. So I'm actually going to be talking about this formally. I'm invited by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and NASA. I'll be in Orlando at the Orlando Hilton next weekend after next, where I'll be presenting a paper, and part of my paper will be about this new discovery. And we'll see if people can refute it. So far, nobody's refuted it. Maybe they haven't paid attention to it. But it's a very precise mathematical proof showing a loophole that there's a more generalized quantum theory, just the way general relativity generalizes special relativity. So you may say there's a general quantum mechanics beyond the orthodox quantum mechanics that David mainly talks about in his book. And all three of us, in June of this year, we were at a American Association for Advancement of Science conference at the University of San Diego at the second retrocausality workshop, in which we heard Darrell Bem, who is a very distinguished professor of experimental psychology at Cornell, give very good experimental peer-reviewed evidence that the future affects the past, that there is this retrocausality in human consciousness. That's a normal attribute of human consciousness. And the key buzzword I want to put into your minds about all this, it's called signal non-locality. That what Darrell Bem was talking about, and what is a new concept, signal non-locality, which violates the no-cloning theorem, that's at the basis of the quantum information theory, as David said. And so the point is, although you can make untappable quantum encryption, it'll still work if you use the right kind of light source. You may have another kind of light source in which you can actually transmit the signals. But we'll see if that turns out to be true or not. I'll turn this over now to Fred. Oh, I got that. Okay.
Well, I'm going to get back to David. And I'm also going to respond to something that I didn't know, and that was that Russell Targ was a magician, or still is a magician. Because the reason I get into physics in the first place has to do with a psychological problem that I had as a child. I began to have a deep stammering incident take place in which I no longer could speak in any fluent or coherent manner. If you asked me to read in front of a classroom from a book, I would not be able to get the words out. I was really in a psychological mess, and this was at a very young age. My mother was so worried about me that she took me to various places where stammerers like me could be examined. She took me to Northwestern University, not far from where I lived in Chicago, and they wanted to drill holes in my head to relieve the pressure of the stammering. And indeed, my mother said, no, I don't think we're going to do that. Fortunately, she was a smart woman. But I was still stammering. And eventually, I got to go to a speech therapist who began to teach me. Now, get this. This is, I'm 9, 10 years old. We're talking 1946, 1945, 46. She's teaching me how to meditate. This is far out. I mean, I didn't know it was called meditation in those days. But I was doing things that were meditative. Like, for example, I would blow bubbles in a glass of water and watch the bubbles. As a result, I could learn to control my breath. She would stand me in front of a mirror, and I would begin to pontificate. And then I began to realize that there's something magical about what I was doing. I didn't really realize it in any kind of logical way, but I got very interested in, of all things, performance magic, close-up magic. And I began to do tricks in front of the mirror, and I delighted in fooling myself. This image, by the way, of a trickster making magic got me into, of all things, theoretical physics. As I mentioned on the radio program we did Sunday night, and David asked me if I would mention this again, there is such a thing, a word that we use, particularly Jack and I, and to some extent Russell, of course, and other physicists, we call it theoretical physics. What that means is physics that you do in your mind. Most people think that's what theoretical physics is, but if you go back to the ancient Greeks and find out where the word theorio, or theoria, where that word comes from in ancient Greek, it means to show, to present. So theory is like stage magic. It's presenting or giving or showing things. Then we go to the ancient Pythagorean school, and what do we find Pythagoras doing with the word theoria? He says, no, it's not just showing, it's passionate showing. It's showing with heart and with your soul and with your feelings. It's not just doing things in the bank of a bank. It's really performance magic that you're doing. And I began to take that to heart. So I got into physics because I was a performer. I was learning to be a performer, to be a theoretical physicist. I loved the ideas. I wanted to know, how did God do this trick called make the universe? I still want to know that because I think it is a trick. And in fact, one of the things that I will mention just shortly is that one of the reasons that Bell's theorem so fascinated me was I began to realize that what Bell's theorem was showing. By the way, let me explain a little bit about Bell's theorem, just a brief little insight. Bell's theorem really sets a limit as to where the classical world and the quantum world are in a sense dividing. Because it says, if you stay within a certain limit, you find that a classical explanation for things is still relevant. But if you go beyond that limit, just means altering the angle between two polarizers in the double experiment where one photon goes one way and the other goes the other way. If you go beyond that limit, then you find that you can't explain it by classical means, which means that there's no way that you can explain it by some kind of obvious trickery that, say, Randy the Magician could do. But some other kind of trickery is involved that doesn't seem to involve local dynamics, which means you can't manipulate what's over here to make what happens over there happen. You can't do that. There's something else going on. And that's what got me intrigued. Maybe we're looking at God's magic show here. How is this being done? What is making this trick emerge this way? And so the insight I got is that we're looking at the division between what's separate and what's not separate. We're looking at the division between unity and duality. We're seeing that blur from unity duality to duality appear in the experiments that we're doing in the things which demonstrate the Bell theorem. And so what I think is really happening is that we're looking at how things are not separated. It's not that a signal, Jack may disagree with this, it's not that we're sending a signal from A to B, it's that we're seeing that A and B are really fundamentally not separated in the first place. To give you an idea of what that might look like, imagine that you're looking at a television screen over here and a television screen over there. On this television screen, what you're seeing is something that looks like a fish head, but then it suddenly flips and it becomes a tail. In fact, it becomes head, tail, head, kind of a random way. You don't even know what it is. What is that, an animal? On the other screen, you're seeing a fish swim back and forth, back and forth. And it's only later that you begin to notice that whenever you see a fish head on this screen, you see this fish swimming to the right. When you see a fish tail on this screen, you see the fish is swimming to the left. While you're watching the screens, you can't tell. You only think, that's a funny phenomena, head, tail, over there, left, right. It's just funny stuff. It's only later that you realize that it's not really two objects separated in space and time. It's one fish being viewed in two different places at the same time. That's what Bell's theorem is showing us, where that unity is. And I think this is where faster than light communication is going to happen, because it's going to be simultaneous realization that we are one. I'm getting a little mystical here, so I'll stop talking.
It's a great pleasure to agree with Fred Allen completely. My little logo pin is not I don't have an American flag pin. I have a yin-yang symbol because I belong to the Church of Non-Duality. And just as Fred Allen was saying, the idea that separation is an illusion is a very apropos description of what we have. The reason that it's no harder to describe faraway things than nearby things is that we misapprehend the whole nature of separation. What we discover is that when you quiet your mind, your awareness is able to describe things that seem to be far away, and the only way they could be described instantaneously is that in consciousness there's no separation. If that sounds mystical, that was first described about 4,000 years ago in the Vedic literature, the idea of Atman equal Brahman, which some of you have heard. That is the Vedic teaching that your awareness is one with all of physical and non-physical space-time. There is no separation between your awareness and the rest of the physical universe. And the Buddhists say that separation is an illusion. Separation is an illusion, especially separation for consciousness. So one of the ideas that stretches from the teachings of Buddha to the present time is that our awareness is independent of space and time, and that's what the data strongly show. The other idea about non-dual apprehension that I want to agree with is we had a question, is Uri Geller a fake? Has Uri Geller been exposed? And the answer to that has to be a non-dual answer. That is, Geller is neither a fake nor not a fake. And that's what Nagarjuna would say 2,000 years ago. Since Geller, in his show, does more or less what hundreds of other people do who pass through our laboratory. That is, remote viewing doesn't require an Israeli magician. Remote viewing is an ability we all have. So as a teenager, I would stand before an audience of adults and delight in fooling the adults with magic tricks. I now stand in front of an array of adults in what we call a remote viewing workshop, and I show the adults how to be psychic. So I start off with what my wife and I think of as the object in the box trick, where I have a big box with an object inside, but instead of doing a trick with the object, I invite all the people in the room to make a drawing of the surprising image that appears in their awareness corresponding to my object. Then I show them the object, and people are astounded that at least half the people in the room will have made a quite good, recognizable drawing of the object I brought in. So it's the idea that psychic ability is not unusual, it's limited because it's forbidden in this society. There are lots of psychics in Iceland or in Holland or in Soviet Union where there are lots of psychics in Iceland because the Icelandic people and the Dutch people didn't kill the witches. So the witches were able to flourish. So you have lots of Icelandic and lots of Dutch psychics. And one other thing that I'll say is that making money with psychic ability is indeed available to do. God will not punish you for trying to use your psychic ability. What can happen is that after you become very good at quieting your mind and learning to experience the things you have to do to make money in the market, a little switch is thrown where you feel that this is really not the way you want to spend your time. So this is not an apology. Nobody's preventing you from doing it, but the people who have been the very best at forecasting markets, eventually, when they really get good, decide that they simply don't want to do that anymore. However, the program had been classified at SRI. We had a top secret program, but it's not secret anymore. I got it declassified through Freedom of Information, and psychic abilities are not going away. If you search for remote viewing in quotation marks on Google, you'll find more than 1 million pages inviting you to learn how to be psychic.
Let me invite you to ask questions. Let me invite you now to ask questions for our panel about any number of things. Any questions for the panelists?
I think I was, I got
Why
involved
don't you
in
go ahead and use the mic.
well, maybe through my father, because I remember once when I was about 3 or 4 years old, he took me on a boat ride in Prospect Park, and they were, the open theater there, they were playing Wagner's some Lohengrin or something, Wagnerian music, and he says, well, he says, I'm a very old soul. That my father was a very old soul, he was very mystical. But your mother's a very young soul, and you are a mixture of the two, but you are going to be the new Einstein. He was always talking about Einstein and relativity and things like that. So that was, lies my father told me at 3 or 4 years old, you believe it, right? But, and then when I was about 4, even before kindergarten, I would always try to think what the future was. And what would I be like in 10 years? What would I be like in 20 years? What would I be like in 50, in 60 years? My God, that's, right? So I would spend hours trying to visualize. That's interesting, because I was trying to precognitively remote view when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And then I was also influenced. I remember I had a gang of older kids. I was the gang leader, and they used to steal toys from me. This is the streets of Flatbush in Brooklyn. This is like 1945. And then one of the kids brought me this book. It was a Disney, I think World War II was still, I think it was like 1945, maybe I was 5 years old. And he brought me this Walt Disney book, maybe it was 46, Walt Disney book, A Future World. So that may be, time and all that. So
Don't you think every Jewish father thinks that his son is Einstein if he's not, or maybe Yasha Heifetz?
Yeah, maybe so. But that was definitely one of the things.
I have a question.
Just one more thing.
Fred.
Jack, by the way, is a very gifted operatic singer. Nobody, I mean, if he wants to, he probably hasn't done it for a while. But I've heard him sing when we were professors at San Diego State. And he's, in fact, when I got separated from my wife, I started living with him and his pet German Shepherd. He likes German Shepherds. Anyway, he would sing. And when he would sing, we'd be playing classical music. He'd be singing in the bathroom. And it was quite thrilling. I mean, he's really very good. And I thought, Jack, why aren't you singing more? Why did you do? And he just didn't want to do it.
Well, no, I mean, I did it I did some opera at San Diego State and the San Diego Civic Opera, and also at Cornell. I did a lot. I was a lead tenor in a bunch of operettas at Cornell, and also at Oberlin Conservatory in the summer stock. This is my 20s. And I was actually offered a scholarship to the Mozarteum when they came in Salzburg, but I had to choose between that and physics. And Stanley Desser at Brandeis said, you made the wrong choice.
So let me ask you actually a bit more about sort of performance. I want to ask Fred and Jack about what it was like when they were teaching at San Diego State. I want to talk about the film you guys made with your students. Just what was it like, in those times and trying to get the big ideas across in some untraditional ways?
Well, Jack is also a film star. I know because I directed him in a movie that I made. It's entitled very modestly, God. And Jack, of course, plays the part of God. The whole film is filmed a good part of the film was filmed on the nudist beach, Black's Beach in La Jolla, and for which we got into a little trouble. We also did some filming in the hallways of the apartment of the character that was playing the part of the heinous devil, the Satan himself, who had a slave that was named Dog, God spelled backwards, of course. We were playing with that. And we had, I was using all the music of the 70s. I love the Doors. I love the Doors then, I love them now. And I had Doors music and all kinds of really psychedelic music. And one time we're filming in the hallways, and suddenly cops come in and arrest us. So here we're sitting, we were arrested. We were actually, well, they weren't going to let us go right away. In fact, the guy who plays the devil comes downstairs into the place where we're sitting around, and I said, we're visiting him, when we're just filming in the hallways. I mean, well, you can't do that, blah, 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 blah.
A lot of semi-nude women, too.
Yeah, well, of course. Well, that goes without saying. You were also semi-nude. I mean, I filmed you semi-nude, too. Yeah, I was filming him running down and up and down Black's Beach with a diaper on. That's right. You were very beautiful, actually. It was fun filming you. Anyway, so we're doing this film, and we're sitting upstairs, and the cops have come in, and the guy that plays the devil, who's a friend of ours, we know him very well, he comes downstairs, and the police ask him, "Do you know these people?" And he says, "I never saw them before in my life." He really said that. He really said that. I never saw them before in my life. And I said, oh my God. I said, we're really up Schitt's Creek here. What are we going to do about this? So finally, we said, well, look, we're professors at San Diego State. We're doing a movie involving my physics for poets class, which is true. And finally they said, well, okay, we'll let you off the hook this time. And they let us go. But I was really worried.
Parts of that film, if you go, if you look at Mobile Me, the public folder, Mobile Me, Sarfatti, just look at Google. Parts of it are actually up on the web, and I think Fred's going to do, but it's badly edited. Because I'm not. But I think at some point, Fred will put the whole thing up on YouTube. It's actually fairly good.
Any other questions for?
In the interest of making corrections, which is my life work, the CIA didn't come to us. Hal Puthoff and I, in our previous incarnation, had both done stuff for the CIA. So we had entree to CIA where other people would probably have had a harder time. We had soft money to start with. Werner Erhard gave us some money. Institute for Noetic Sciences gave us money. Richard Bach gave us some money. So we did our first experiments with two very great psychics, Pat Price and Ingo Swann, sort of psychic hide and go seek, where I would be the psychic tour director, psychic travel agent sitting in a little shielded room with somebody like Jack, and I would say, they've taken Hal and hidden him somewhere in the Bay Area, describe where he is. And the people that I was interviewing did that very, very well. And it became clear to us that under good conditions, working with a talented person, you could reliably describe where the hidden person was taken. So Hal and I, we're both from Chicago, and we're both only children, and we're both sort of difficult physicists who are accustomed to having our own way. So Hal and I had the idea that we could go to the CIA, get an interview with the director of intelligence at CIA, who's John McMahon, and we thought that we could persuade him to give us money, spend half of our time on trying to understand psychic ability and half our time doing operational things for the CIA. And after our 2 years of preliminary work with these two great psychics, we then convinced the CIA to support our program. They asked us to do a demonstration of ability task, which was to describe a hidden Soviet R&D facility in Soviet Siberia. Pat Price, the psychic policeman, did that excellently, and that was really a key to our next decade of support. I should say one other thing about Pat Price. I'm writing a book now called A Physicist's Proof of Psychic Abilities, Why I Believe in ESP. And since we're here in San Francisco, what Price did for the San Francisco Police Department, 1974, when Patricia Hearst was kidnapped. Some of you might remember that. The daughter of the publisher of the San Francisco Examiner was kidnapped from her Berkeley dorm. The following day, we were asked to go to Berkeley and see if we could help the police. Pat Price, the psychic policeman from Burbank, stood at a big table, turned the pages of a mug book, a loose leaf binder with dozens of pictures of the usual perpetrator. He turned page after page, then he put his finger on one guy and said, "That's the perpetrator, that's the ringleader." And he put his finger on Donald DeVries, who it turned out 2 weeks later was indeed the ringleader. They then asked him, well, the famous movie lingo, which way'd they go? Pat said they went that way, they went north. I see a white station wagon in front of a diner across from 2 large gas cylinders by a pedestrian overpass. One of the policemen recognized that was near Vallejo. They dispatched a cruiser, found the car, and it still had the shells, the cartridges that we had seen in Patricia Hearst's apartment. So within 20 minutes, Price walked up to the desk, found the kidnapper, and then told him where to go to find the car. So that's one of the miracles that makes me believe in ESP.
Let me also say that the CIA also came to me in North Beach in the guise of Harold Chipman, who was chief of station, Central Intelligence in San Francisco, where they had an office at the immigration building down there on 550 Battery, around there. But he worked with Pat Price, and he told me and other people in North Beach, Kim Burafato was a witness to this, about Pat Price. We heard a lot about, he was working with Pat Price, and he also said that he was the spook behind, although he said you guys, you were put off and you didn't really know, but he was like one of the spooks behind keeping the funding going for them at SRI. You met Chipman at Henry Dakin's Washington Square in the 80s. He came out. Do you remember meeting him? Creon was there, and Kim was there, and he kind of, I remember you guys were talking, this is like in the 80s, in the mid-80s. But Chipman did tell me that they had many operational successes, not only domestically, not only with what Russ told you about the Hearst thing, but also in the Soviet Union. Operations, covert operations against targets in the Soviet Union based on remote viewing, actual operational things.
Yeah, please.
Is there any neuroscience on what's going on in the brain during psychic abilities?
So the question was whether there's any knowledge from neuroscience about what happens in the brain during these sort of psychic episodes.
Actually, there is. And it's funny that this is also around the same time period. Benjamin Libet, who was a neurophysiologist at UC San Francisco, working with Bertram Feinstein, the former husband of Dianne Feinstein. He was a physician, and he also performed in the operating theater by cutting open people's heads and taking off skull caps to get inside, to do surgery within the brain. And what ensued was the following discussion. What Libet was interested in was the timing of conscious experience. When exactly are we conscious, and what is the brain telling us in terms of when we are actually conscious? Can we measure a time in which we are conscious? Can we see consciousness being measured right there? Well, of course, you place electrodes on somebody's, like my bald forehead, and you can get some measurements being made. But if you can actually get right into the surface of the brain, the cortical regions of the brain, and put electrodes there, you can really make very good measurements. I mean, this is the way to do it, of course. And to do such a thing now might be a little bit, we don't want to do that kind of thing. But these people had to have brain surgery. The brain, as you know, consists of, or you may not know, consists of two kinds of cellular tissue. One is, of course, the neuronal tissue, which conducts electrical signals between axons, or whatever you want to call that. And there's also something called glia cells. These are like fatty cells that many people are now suspecting have a lot to do with consciousness. People didn't know that at the time. But these people that had brain tumors were having glia cells. They were the ones that typically get cancer. The neuronal cells usually don't. So these people had to have some experiments done in which their tumors were removed. But what Libet was able to do was to time signals. He would prick people's skin or touch them, or touch the foot or the leg or the toe or the finger, and he could watch when the signal actually received what is called neuronal adequacy. You could see when that part of the somatosensory cortical region would get excited. I'm not going to go into all the details of the experiment, but what he showed was that people would actually respond in different ways depending on whether another signal was introduced into the brain via the cortical excitation directly as late as a quarter of a second after the original stimulus. You stimulate a person, for example, you're standing at the starting gate and the gun goes off and off you go. How much time does it take before you recognize that a signal is going off? It's probably less than 1/10 of a second, because if you're waiting too long, especially in a 100-yard dash, you're not going to make it. So people are pretty much primed for that signal, but in a certain sense what he was showing is they have to be psychically primed. They have to know ahead of time that the signal's coming at that time. Now, maybe you've not had the experience. I was an athlete in high school, and I played football. And often when you're playing football, I was a quarterback. And when you're playing football, often you can't know, you think you know where your receivers are going when they're going out for a pass, but you don't always know it. Especially, a lot of times you get hit before you would complete your pass. But I psychically was able to complete touchdown passes by throwing to where I knew where he was going to be, but I never saw the end. I never saw him receive it. And guys would come up to me and say, "God, you threw a good pass." I said, "I did." I didn't know, because I was on my ass by that time, and that's the kind of so what Libet was showing, and what we're talking about here, is the ability to see at least as much as a quarter of a second into the future. That's been documented. In fact, I've written a very lengthy paper in the Journal of Scientific Exploration explaining all of Libet's data and offering a kind of quantum physical pseudo-model. It's not really a strong model. It's not a really strong theory, but it gives some indication as to how maybe quantum physics might explain this. But regardless of whether the explanation is right or not, Libet has shown that there is an effect from the future coming back to the present. And that's a subject that Jack is extremely interested in.
Well, Fred, if I were going to bet my career, see, in the 70s, I bet my career, I gave up a career in laser physics and bet my career that I could teach people how to do psychic stuff. My first gizmo was an ESP teaching machine. Oh, I should say, my ESP teaching machine that I built for NASA is now online as a free application for the iPhone. So in addition to some entertainment, you can carry away a free application called ESP Trainer to download for your iPhone. And we did that for a year with NASA, and people improved their ability to do that task. And the idea is you learn to get in touch with what it feels like when you're psychic. But I digress. I would bet my career on the important thing to do next is to understand the nature of the space-time in which we live, rather than try to do the neurophysiology of ESP. Because I think that the neurophysiology of brain functioning is a moving target. That is, it's very hard to remove the part of the brain that controls anything, because another part of the brain will take it up and, because of plasticity, begin to function that way. That's a new hot part of neuroanatomy, of course. And also, as a physicist, I'm quite ignorant of neuroanatomy. So obviously, I'm interested in the nature of space-time. But the fact that we are able to experience things in the distance and things in the future shows that the non-local space-time in which we live is something we are just beginning to understand. The yogis, of course, 4,000 years ago, probably understood it much more than we do from an experiential way. If you read Patanjali at the time of Christ or other Buddha writings at the time of Christ, they took all of these things for granted. That is, you did not have to be a special person. In the flower ornament scripture, you have 100 pages describing looking into the future, looking into the distance, diagnosing illnesses, written at the time of Christ, and any quiet yogi was expected to be able to do this. And the idea of looking into the time, into the future, was recognized as just the same as looking into the distance. So I think that if you can find a way to put your money into psychic research, this is a good time to do it, because historically, whenever something is known to be true and there aren't a lot of investors, it's an opportunity to make some money. So I think that exploring the nature of the space-time in which we live is the most exciting opportunity available for us.
Okay.
So we're,
I just have one short comment to add. I wrote a book called The Yoga of Time Travel, in which I talk about the very thing that you just talked about. Russell, you and I are really on the psychic same web page more than I ever thought. It's called Kalavankara. That's what they called it, Kalavankara. And what it means in Sanskrit is cheating time.
Okay. And let me just add to that, because I want to bring it back more to the hardcore physics. But physics is basically an experimental science. Richard Feynman said the most beautiful theory can be murdered by an ugly fact. And the ugly fact for a lot of uptight physics pundits like Goudsmith, he's dead now, but people like Goudsmith, who didn't allow this kind of research to be published in Physical Review. The ugly fact is that these kinds of effects now are being replicated more and more. What Fred started talking about, Libet's work, that was later done, not with brain surgery, but a very similar kind of work was done by, was Dean Radin, right? Dean Radin, and then a guy named Dick Bierman in Utrecht, Utrecht is in Holland anyway, maybe Amsterdam, was very skeptical. He said, well, I'm going to disprove this crazy psychic stuff. And he's a very honest experimental psychologist. And he replicated Radin's work. And the latest in this now is the Darrell Bem. Darrell Bem is like a distinguished, one of the most distinguished professors at Cornell, full tenured professor at Cornell in experimental psychology, and his work has been, peer-reviewed by the community, and it passes all the tests, and it's basically confirming these retrocausal effects. We don't really have time to get into this. We could start talking about the cosmological significance, Hawking's mind of God, things like this. How all these how the non-separability really works, because there's kind of a collective consciousness, perhaps, and this gets us to what's called the hologram, that the universe may be a hologram, all kinds of pretty fascinating things, but I don't think there's enough time for that for tonight.
in fact, I think Fred said it best when he said we can't cheat time, and that seems as good a place as any to pause here. Let's thank the panelists very much for fascinating